The suspect sits in a windowless room, exhausted, staring at a signed piece of paper that will send him to prison for the rest of his life. The signature is his own. The details of the crime are written in his own words. Yet the physical evidence at the crime scene tells an entirely different story. The blood types do not match, the ballistics profile is completely wrong, and the timeline is a physical impossibility. This is the paradox of the modern criminal justice system. A confession is universally viewed as the ultimate trump card in a courtroom, a silver bullet that cuts through the fog of reasonable doubt. Juries believe that no rational human being would ever admit to a heinous crime they did not commit. But history, and the relentless march of forensic science, has proven that assumption fatally flawed. To understand how innocent people can be psychologically cornered into signing away their own freedom, we have to examine the architecture of the modern interrogation room. For over half a century, that room was built on the foundation of a single, highly structured psychological playbook. It was a method designed to break down walls, but it inadvertently constructed a machine that could manufacture guilt. The architect of this machine was a man named John E. Reid. In the early to mid-20th century, American law enforcement was grappling with a massive public relations crisis regarding the so-called third degree. Police interrogations were often brutal, relying on physical violence, sleep deprivation, and starvation to extract admissions of guilt. The courts were beginning to crack down on these constitutional violations, rendering beaten confessions inadmissible. Law enforcement needed a new weapon, one that left no physical bruises but achieved the exact same result. John E. Reid, a former Chicago police officer and polygraph expert, stepped into this void. He recognized that the future of criminal investigations lay not in physical coercion, but in psychological domination. He understood that the human mind could be manipulated just as effectively as the human body. In 1955, Reid cemented his legacy in the case of Daryl Parker, a man whose wife was found murdered in their home. After hours of relentless questioning by Reid himself, Parker confessed to the crime. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Decades later, another man confessed to the murder, and independent evidence corroborated the new confession. Parker was innocent, yet Reid had broken him completely. Despite the underlying flaw exposed by the Parker case, the methodology Reid utilized was packaged, refined, and sold to law enforcement agencies across the globe. It became the Reid technique, the undisputed gold standard for police training in the United States. By the 1960s, it was the dominant paradigm, fundamentally altering the landscape of criminal justice. The Reid technique is not merely a conversation, it is a highly choreographed, guilt-presumptive psychological assault. It begins before the formal interrogation even starts, with what is known as the behavioral analysis interview. During this phase, investigators ask non-accusatory questions to establish a baseline of the suspect's behavior, looking for perceived signs of deception like crossed arms, averted eye contact, or nervous shifting. The fatal flaw in this initial phase is that modern behavioral science has thoroughly debunked the idea that investigators can reliably detect deception through body language. Nervousness is often just a symptom of being interrogated by the police. However, once the investigator decides the suspect is lying, the process shifts from an objective fact-finding mission to a relentless pursuit of a confession. The formal interrogation initiates with Step 1, direct positive confrontation. The investigator enters the room, stands in the suspect's personal space, and states with absolute certainty that the suspect committed the crime. There is no room for debate. The investigator claims to have undeniable evidence of guilt, even if that evidence is entirely fabricated. In the United States, it is perfectly legal for police to lie to suspects about the evidence they possess. Step 2 involves theme development. This is where the interrogation psychology truly takes hold. The investigator transitions from an adversary to a sympathetic confidant. They offer the suspect a moral justification for the crime. They might suggest the victim had it coming, or that the act was a crime of passion rather than premeditated murder. The goal is to minimize the moral weight of the offense, making a confession feel like the path of least resistance. Steps 3 and 4 are designed to shut down any assertions of innocence. The investigator is trained to recognize when a suspect is about to issue a denial and must cut them off immediately. Every time a suspect successfully voices a denial, they psychologically fortify their position. By constantly interrupting and refusing to hear claims of innocence, the investigator instills a profound sense of hopelessness. As the suspect is beaten down psychologically, they often enter a state of passivity, covered in Steps 5 and 6. The investigator maintains close physical proximity, maintaining eye contact, and offering constant sympathy and understanding. The suspect, exhausted, isolated, and convinced that their situation is entirely hopeless, begins to look to the investigator for a way out of the unbearable pressure of the room. This leads to step 7, the most critical and controversial maneuver in the Reid technique, the alternative question. The investigator presents two highly incriminating choices for what happened. One choice paints the suspect as a monster who acted maliciously, while the other frames the suspect as a victim of circumstance who made a momentary mistake. Both choices are an admission of guilt. Faced with the illusion of a lesser evil, the suspect grasps at the socially acceptable excuse. They agree to the minimized scenario. Once that verbal admission is secured, steps 8 and 9 involve expanding the admission into a full narrative and documenting it in a written or recorded confession. The trap is sprung, and the case is effectively closed. For decades, this method produced results, clearing cases and securing convictions at an astonishing rate. It was viewed as an infallible tool of justice. But a historical analysis of the technique reveals a terrifying blind spot. The psychological levers pulled during these interrogations, isolation, fabricated evidence, minimization of consequences, and relentless pressure, are exactly the conditions required to break an innocent mind. The turning point in our understanding of these interrogations came in the 1990s with the advent of forensic DNA testing. Suddenly, the justice system had an unimpeachable, objective scientific tool that could definitively prove guilt or innocence. And as the Innocence Project and other organizations began testing biological evidence from old cases, a horrifying pattern emerged from the darkness. Men and women who had provided detailed, signed confessions were being entirely excluded by the DNA evidence. The chain of custody was secure, the genetic profiles were absolute, and the results were undeniable. These people had confessed to rapes and murders they did not commit. The justice system was forced to confront a reality it had long denied. False confessions were not an anomaly. They were a systemic feature. When researchers began to analyze the transcripts and recordings of these false confessions, they found the fingerprints of the Reid technique all over them. The guilt-presumptive nature of the method created a massive confirmation bias. Investigators, convinced they had the right person based on flawed behavioral analysis, pushed forward with extreme psychological pressure until the suspect simply broke. This pressure is particularly devastating to vulnerable populations. Juveniles whose brains are still developing and who are highly susceptible to authority figures are disproportionately represented in false confession registries. Similarly, individuals with cognitive impairments or mental health struggles are easily overwhelmed by the rapid-fire accusations, the fabricated evidence, and the complex hypothetical scenarios presented by trained interrogators. Even neurotypical, highly educated adults can fall victim to this psychological warfare. When a person is isolated in a small room for 12 to 16 hours, deprived of sleep, lied to about fingerprint matches or satellite imagery, and told that a confession is their only ticket home, their perception of reality begins to warp. They begin to believe that confessing is their only immediate means of survival. They rationalize that if they just sign the paper to escape the room, the truth will eventually come out. They trust the legal system. They believe their innocence will be proven by a judge, or by habeas corpus petitions, or by the very evidence the police claim to have. They do not realize that the moment they sign that confession, the investigation stops, and their fate is sealed. The realization that this dominant interrogation model can cause such catastrophic errors has sent shockwaves through the global law enforcement community. The reliance on deception, coercion, and minimization is increasingly viewed not as a hallmark of elite detective work, but as a severe liability. A confession obtained through psychological manipulation is no longer considered the gold standard of evidence. It is a potential vector for a wrongful conviction. In response to this mounting crisis, a profound shift is occurring in how police are trained to conduct interviews. Many jurisdictions, particularly in the United Kingdom and parts of Europe, abandoned guilt-presumptive methods decades ago. They transitioned to models focused on information gathering rather than confession extraction. The most prominent of these is the PEACE method, an acronym for preparation and planning, engage and explain, account, closure, and evaluate. Unlike the Reid technique, the PEACE method strictly prohibits investigators from lying to suspects about evidence. It forbids the use of manipulative theme development and alternative questions. Instead, the investigator acts as an objective fact-finder. They ask open-ended questions, encourage the suspect to provide a full, uninterrupted narrative, and then systematically probe that narrative for inconsistencies against the known physical evidence. This modern approach recognizes that if a suspect is truly guilty, their lies will eventually buckle under the weight of objective facts. There is no need to feed them a narrative or coerce an admission. By allowing suspects to speak freely, investigators lock them into a story. When the forensic evidence, the cell tower data, the financial records, the ballistics, contradicts that story, the deception is exposed cleanly and legally. The transition away from the psychological warfare of the 20th century is slow, and resistance remains within departments that have relied on the old ways for generations. But the tide is undeniably turning. Courts are increasingly scrutinizing the methods used in the interrogation room, and defense attorneys are highly educated on the specific psychological triggers that lead to false admissions of guilt. The legacy of John E. Reid is a complex one, a testament to the power of human psychology and the danger of unchecked authority. It revolutionized criminal investigations, but it also left a trail of shattered lives in its wake. As forensic science continues to advance, the interrogation room must evolve alongside it. The ultimate goal of any investigator cannot simply be to secure a confession. The goal must always be the relentless, objective pursuit of the truth.